Kids may be dismissed to kids' worship. And if you have your Bibles, turn to Matthew 19. Okay, so we are still in the midst of our family emphasis time. And today I want to talk about the traditional American family and its place in modern society. So if you have your Bibles, Matthew 19, we're going to start at verse 4. And he said, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let no man separate." We started observing this family emphasis time over 20 years ago. And so every year from Mother's Day to Father's Day, we put a little emphasis on the family and talk about the family. But you know, as time has gone on and on in doing this, I find it more and more difficult because our view about family so many times is so contrary to what the world looks at anymore. And it's almost like we're a few people crying out in the wilderness about the need to preserve the American family. You know, family is an issue that was very important in the Bible. The oldest book, at least the oldest book we think it is, in the Bible is Job, which is a book that deals with family. Job and his wife, and we don't know her name, but they had 14 children. They went through a lot of issues. They went from financial prosperity to ruin, back to financial prosperity. They went through a great deal of distress when it came to the death of their first 7 children, and grief and strife and relationship problems that occurred from that, to blessings when the last 7 children were born. There's a lot of family issues that you can look at and dig through in the book of Job. But that's not the only family that's important in the Bible. There's Adam and Eve, that first family, which had a lot of issues in their family. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel, then Leah, you can't forget her. But Rachel was the one that Jacob loved and the one he wanted. So you look at these families, and each one of these families are very dysfunctional. There are a lot of issues that they went through. Many issues that families today still go through. Okay? But then there's another important family. There's the family of Mary and Joseph. We know Jesus was born of Mary, a virgin. But she was espoused to be married to a man named Joseph, and indeed Joseph did marry her at the Lord's encouragement. And they developed a family. And Jesus wasn't an only child. There were at least 4 brothers and some sisters. We don't know how many. It just says sisters, plural. So there's a family. And in Jewish families, Jewish boys had to learn a trade. Joseph was a carpenter. And Jesus is referred to sometimes as a carpenter. So he must have learned his trade from his earthly father, Joseph. And so we see families functioning as families, even in Jesus' family. Now, so there's a lot of emphasis on family throughout the Bible, Old and New Testament. None of them were the perfect family, but they were families. But as we think about family today, the image of family has changed drastically in the last few years. And so many people today are not sure what it is that makes up the traditional family unit. And so I want us to think about the traditional family for a minute, and I want us to look at some pictures from old television shows. Let's look at the first one. Anybody remember this one?
Yes.
All right. Now Leave It to Beaver. All right. Let's look at the next one. Anybody remember that one? Ozzie and Harriet. All right. Let's come forward a few years. Anybody remember this one? All right. Now, okay. And let's come forward a few more years. Anybody know that one?
That's Family Guy.
The Family Guy. All right. Now, I don't watch that one. No, I don't recommend watching that one, but it's making a point I want to make. Looking at those four pictures, what do they all have in common? A mom and a dad and children. The definition of a traditional family is a husband and a wife and their biological and or adopted children. That's a traditional family. Okay? A husband and wife, their biological and or adopted children. Now, traditional family used to be very important. Okay, when you go back to the days of Leave It to Beaver, Ozzie and Harriet, Father Knows Best, some of those old shows, there was a lot of emphasis on the traditional family. In 1970, traditional families accounted for 40% of U.S. households. By 1990, that percentage had dropped to 25.6%. In the 2010 U.S. Census, 20% of households were traditional families. So, what's the reason for the decline? Because even in recent modern times, television still portrays, in some shows, family as a mother, father, and children. Whether we like the show or not, that portrayal is there. Now, of course, there's another show that's on television right now that's called Modern Family. I don't watch that one either because I don't agree with any of the content that goes on in that one. That portrays something entirely different from traditional family. We've got to fight for the American family. And maybe some things about the American family is some myths about traditional families. Because some people think family starts when two people fall in love and decide to get married. But you know, that's a fairly recent thing. In fact, that's more of an American thing than the rest of the world. You go back to Bible times, marriages were arranged. For most cultures, marriages were arranged. In fact, still in Africa and India, marriages are arranged. So, Marriage doesn't necessarily mean that two people have to fall in love and decide to get married, but they have to understand Jesus' definition of what marriage was. A man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two become one flesh. That's Jesus' definition of marriage. So, we need to not just think about some myths. There's another one, another myth. The other myth is this, that the mom's supposed to be a stay-at-home mom. All right? We probably get that idea from shows like Leave It to Beaver and Ozzie and Harriet and Father Knows Best and those shows in the late 50s, early 60s. We probably had that concept in our head from that point. But that's not always been the case. And we can prove that from the Bible. So if you go to Proverbs chapter 31, and in verse 13 it says, she seeks wool and flax and works willingly with her hands. In verse 16 it says, she considers a field and buys it, and with the fruit of her hands she plants a vineyard. And then you go to verse 18 and 19, she perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. And then in verse 24, it says she makes linen garments and sells them, and she delivers sashes to the merchants. Sounds like that Proverbs 31 woman was a pretty good businesswoman. She worked, and she made her money. But down through history, that's been true. Think about in our own culture. In the days when our country was basically a rural country and dominated by an agricultural society, did Mom work? Right out in the field with Dad, right? And where were the children? Right behind them. It was a family affair as they worked. All right? And that's important. Everybody worked. Everybody pulled their weight. Everybody made the family functional. And that's where they were able to spend their time together, where they were able to work together and play together. That's important. So those myths about traditional family, we need to put them aside and understand that family is a husband and wife and their children. That's a family. But what's happening in America today? All right, there's several issues going on today. Americans are putting off the big milestones in life. Like, first one, the median age for men and women to get married. For men, it's 29, and for women, it's 27. Back in back in 2013, only 20% or 26% of people between the ages of 18 and 32 were married. That's just 1 out of 4 people between the ages of 18 and 32. In 1960, it was 65%. It was over half, way over half. People are getting married much later. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but that's what's happening. So the next thing seems very logical. They're having children much later in life. All right? They're waiting. In 1960, women between the ages of 15 and 24 accounted for 40% of the mothers with infants. By 2011, that number had dropped to 22%. So not only are they waiting longer, they're having less children. The average family now has 1.9 children, compared to 1960, when the average family had 3.7 children. Now, the alarming fact about the 1.9 is that that is below the replacement rate for the number of births needed to replace the parents in the population. The population in the families should have 2.1 children to replace the parents in the population. Now it's 1.9. What does that mean? It means society as we know it will not exist if it continues at that rate. All right, it's definitely going to change. Not only are those numbers alarming, but families are constructed different today. There are a lot of blended families. They're blended families because there's lots of broken homes. And so they're blended families as other people unite. And now, all of a sudden, everybody seems to have a stepbrother or stepsister. All right? Almost half of the young people today, ages 18 to 29, have at least one step sibling. Okay, so that means that they don't understand the definition of the traditional family: a husband, a wife, and their children, and that husband and wife living together until death do they part. That's a problem. More babies are being born to unmarried mothers than ever before. In 1960, only 5% of babies born were born to unmarried mothers. Today, it's 41%. 41%. And then, now there's a lot of single parents. All right, and single parents come about for a couple of different reasons. One reason could be the death of a spouse, right? And that happens. We know that happens. Divorce occurs, and we know that happens. And then there's some people that just choose not to get married, but to be a parent. And so they're single parents. Now, in the case of a death or a divorce that's beyond your control, I mean, there's not a lot you can do about that. But the choice to be a single parent, think about what you're robbing your child of having by not having a mother and a father. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong to choose to be single. Some people have that gift. Paul would have encouraged all of us to have been single, but he said he realized that not everybody had that same gift, and some people need to marry. And I think most of us fall in that category, that we need to marry. But I do recognize some people have that gift of singleness, and that's a blessing from God. And so use it to honor God if you have that gift. But children need a mother and a father. I mean, think about it. Even God recognized that it was not good that the man should be alone. And so He created Eve. God recognized that. Now, another thing that's happening is same-sex marriages. I don't believe in that. You all know that. I think it's entirely wrong. It's nothing natural about it. All right? But think about, again, what's happening to the children in this situation. You have two fathers, or you have two mothers, and you don't get what you need. If you have two mothers, you don't get what you need from a father. If you have two fathers, you don't get what you need from a mother. You know, God created male and female both in His image. And there's a reason for that. So that we could get both sides of all of His image in there, right? When we think about mothers, we think about loving and nurturing and, you know, the caring aspect of a mother. We think about fathers, we think about, you know, more rules. We think about hard work. We think about different things as we look at the different roles. The children need all of these things that they get from a mother and a father, and not from a same-sex marriage. Then we face another issue today that's becoming more and more of an issue than ever before, and that's multicultural families. Multicultural families. That's, you know, marrying outside of your culture. It may be marrying somebody from a totally different part of the world. And that in itself is not necessarily bad, but there's one big issue that needs to be considered in that. And that is, what about religion? What about religion? If you marry somebody from a totally different part of the world, do they have the same faith you have? Or do they have something different? And we need to think about that. Because if you're somebody from a different family, how are you going to raise your children? You're going to raise them as Christians? You're going to raise them as Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists? What are you going to raise them as? That's something we have to think about. And we need to understand what the Scripture says about it. In 2 Corinthians 6:14 it says, "Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers." Christians are supposed to marry Christians and not anybody else. That's important to understand in preserving the traditional American family. Christians marry Christians and raise Christians. That's important. Another thing that comes closely associated with that idea of religion is, well, what holidays are you going to celebrate? You know, each religion has its own holiday. And those holidays teach us very important things about religion. Let's just think about Christianity for a minute. Our two main holidays are Christmas and Easter. Christmas, what does it teach us? It teaches us about the incarnation of God. It teaches us about the virgin birth. It teaches us tremendously important aspects of our faith. What about Easter? It teaches us about the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus, doesn't it? Very important aspects about our faith. If you marry somebody that's not a Christian, they're not going to be concerned about those important aspects of our faith. And so it's important that Christians understand the importance of marrying Christians so that we can raise children that are Christians. So, what is the purpose of the traditional family in our modern society? How does it fit in? What is it supposed to do? Well, understand first of all that the traditional family recognizes God's design. God created a man and a woman to live together for a lifetime. That's the definition of a traditional family. That's what we've got to understand. And so the traditional family is God's design, and we need to model that to the world. But as we think about that, it fulfills God's design because it wasn't good for man to be alone. Man and woman united together, work together, and complete God's intent. And so when we do that, there's some other things that go with that. The procreation of children. In Genesis 1:27-28, God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created them, male and female He created them. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Procreation is one of the reasons for the traditional family. Because you get into those non-traditional families and they can't have children the way God designed it. That's important. A self-centered society really has no time for children. And so one of the basic functions of families is to bring those children into the world. Now, going right along with that, if we're going to bring them into the world, then we have to nurture the children. They develop a sense of worth in the home, and then they can face the world with security because it's been given to them at home. That's important. You know, not only as we nurture them, not only they get security, they understand many basic things from home. One of the criticisms I often hear about homeschooling, I heard it the whole time we homeschooled our kids, and anybody that homeschools, you've heard this, they don't get socialization. Now, anybody knows our family knows that wasn't true. Our kids had plenty of socialization. Because where does socialization start? Doesn't it start in the home? Isn't that where they learn respect? Isn't that where they learn to follow rules? Isn't that where they learn the basic concepts? It should be. Those things need to be taught at home, and children need to learn to obey their parents at home. And when they do that, then they'll learn to respect authority in all other aspects of life. Susanna Wesley said, if a child doesn't learn to obey his or her parents at home, they will never learn to respect the authority of man or God in society. I think Susanna Wesley was a smart woman. That she raised two great preachers. She knew what she was talking about. And thinking about that, here's the next aspect of that traditional American family. To teach Christianity to our children. To teach Christianity to our children. You know, I hear so many times today, we're going to let our child decide. You're going to let your child decide what? You know, and they think about that in every kind of aspect. Like, well, we're just going to let our child decide. And you know what? Your child's going to be one wild, crazy, mixed up person that don't know what they want. Because what children need is guidance, direction, boundaries. Right? That's the biggest thing. Think about it. We're all Americans when we're thinking about Memorial Day this weekend. All right? What gives us freedom in this country? What gives us the freedom to be American citizens? Isn't it the Constitution of the United States? And that Constitution of the United States becomes the basis for all laws and rules and order. And we're free. Does that mean I can go out here on the highway and drive 80 miles an hour? No. There are rules about that. If I get out there at 80 miles an hour, Josh's going to be looking for me. All right? So that you can't do that. We have rules. We have guidance. We have boundaries. Our children need rules, guidance, boundaries. They need to be taught about Jesus Christ if they want to be truly free. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 6 and 7, it says this, "And these words I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. When are you supposed to teach your children about Jesus? All day long. When those teachable moments arise, don't miss them. Jump on them and teach them about Jesus Christ so they truly can be free. Dr. John Trent tells a story about a couple in West Texas. The wife, Betty, was very athletic. She had been a cheerleader at a very popular high school. She was now 55 years old, and she came to Dr. Trent for some medical help. She was hurting a lot, especially in all of her joints. And those joints were beginning to swell. So after examining her, Dr. Trent looked at her and said, "You have rheumatoid arthritis, and there's no cure." Well, Betty just broke down. She just couldn't hardly take the news. And about that time, her tall, leatherly faced West Texas cowboy husband walked in the room and sat down beside her. Betty looked at him and said, "Rusty, you need to get a divorce. I can't be a wife to you anymore. It hurts every time I move. I can't even hold your hand. And for your own sake, you need a woman who can really love you. Why don't you get a divorce? You go your way and I'll go mine." Rusty sat down beside of her on the stool, looked her in the eye, and said, "Betty, can you smile? It doesn't hurt to smile." He said, "All I need is a smile." And then he said, "Well, really, that's not even true. I don't need a smile. All I need is you." You see, that's the commitment to family that we need today. The commitment a husband and wife should have to one another. And if they have that commitment to one another, they'll have that commitment to their children. And that's the kind of family we need, because a family that functions together in the ups and in the downs, in the good and in the bad, a family is always there, letting the family members know you are loved and accepted no matter what happens. Think about your marriage vows. Didn't you say, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health? Those are the words that we said. Those are the words that were a vow made not just to the person you married, but to God also. Because that is God's intention. The church and the family are the only two hopes we have for our society to continue. So they ought to be allies. The church ought to be helping the family. And the family ought to be supporting the church so that we can cope in this rapidly changing world and try our best to bring it back into a right relationship with God. So what about it today? Family's important. But there's another family that's tremendously important. And that's the family of God. If you're here today and you don't belong to a family, there's always the family of God that you can join. A God of love, a God of grace, a God of mercy, a God who loved you so much He gave His only begotten Son, that if you believe in Him and obey His commands, faith, repentance, confession, baptism, Christian living, you obey those commands, you can have the hope of eternal life. If you're here this morning, you have a decision you need to make for Jesus, won't you come while we stand and sing Amazing Grace?